In 2001, the British sculptor Rachel Whiteread, then aged 38, made her name across the world with a body of work which portrayed the influence of American minimalism and British post-war sculpture. Her work's renowned for taking ordinary, discarded household objects and immortalising them in concrete, resin, plaster and rubber. Her work occupies prominent public spaces around the world, and she works from London, where she's lived since the age of 8. Can you remember, was there a time when you decided that you wanted to become an artist, or did it just grow?
My mother's an artist, and I was always brought up in a very kind of creative environment. I remember as a really small child sharpening her pencils, and that was one of the clear, being allowed the Stanley knife, that was really sharp, and I was able to kind of and she could sharpen pencils incredibly beautifully, and I would sort of teach myself to do that. It's probably my first sculptural experience. But
Rachel Whiteread trained as a painter in Brighton, but switched to sculpture for a postgraduate degree back in London. She began by casting household objects reclaimed from the streets.
Well, I think the streets and scrapyards of London are definitely my sketchbook. It's where I kind of go around and rummage through to sort of find things that I'm looking for, but also to sort of get some kind of inspiration. I've had some very strange experiences in various second-hand shops where I'm kind of clambering around underneath things and people are wondering what on earth I'm doing. And it's like I'm a kind of antique dealer, but I'm looking at a piece of crappy old...
You have to be a bag lady, right?
sort of crappy old bit of 1960s furniture,
She was a controversial person from the start. She'd taken to an extreme one of the prevailing notions of the last, say, 75, 80 years, that in everything there can be discerned aesthetic quality. Duchamp was the great godfather of all this. Here's a urinal, I declare it a work of art, I am Duchamp, it's now a work of art. More or less what he said. Well, Rachel went into that area. Mundane objects were capable of being seen as, or being somehow mildly altered to turn into objects worthy of looking at and looking at again and being works of art.
Closet was the first piece of sculpture that I made that was 3 dimensions that you could walk around. And that's not necessarily how I would describe a sculpture, but it was something that I tried to do for about 7 years. And finally I made this thing in the studio that you could walk around and it had a presence. And I thought about, as a kid, sitting inside wardrobes, which was something that I did, not because I was a freak, but because it was a kind of, I suppose, the interesting blackness, the smell of clothes, the incredibly kind of secure black space, and the little chinks of light that you'd see through the keyholes or whatever. And what I wanted to do was to try and illustrate that. So I bought a wardrobe that was sort of similar to the one that I would have sat in, and turned it on its back. I had no idea what I was doing, really. Filled it with plaster and then ripped the sort of carcass off. And what I had was the inside of the wardrobe, which I then covered in black felt. And I used black felt because I wanted a very dense material that would just sort of absorb all the light.
I think what's really special about Rachel's work is that she is informed by traditions of object sculpture that were happening internationally in the 1960s. For example, American minimalism, where Carl Andre was taking bricks or Donald Judd was making serially repeated minimal forms. But she's turned it back to having this intimacy and narrative. So she's using domestic items and casting them. And she's talking about memory and loss and, the experiences of her childhood. And one of her earliest works, Shallow Breath, which she made shortly after her father died, was the cast of the underside of a bed. And it's this kind of impossible non-space, somewhere you might squeeze into as a child. And she finds these spaces, as with the inside of the cupboards or underside of chairs that she's cast, where We can all relate to them. Spaces in the houses that we live in, the kind of smell that there might be in this kind of, you know, forgotten, hidden space. And she makes it solid as an encapsulation of that memory and that kind of secret space.
In 1990, Rachel Whiteread made a huge new sculpture, Ghost, which was the cast in plaster of the inside of a whole North London bedsit.
I had been thinking about the 4 elements that would be in a bed-sitting room, a bed, a wardrobe, and a dressing table, and a hot water bottle. And so I'd sort of then reversed that and started to think about the space that would be in. I got the room from Acme, where I had a studio, and they had some houses up in Archway, and it was sort of semi-derelict house. And I was delighted, actually, when that came up, because it was so near where I had grown up, and it felt right.
The work that brought you to a wider public attention, and maybe the first woman to win the Turner Prize, was House, your cast of the house in East London. How did that come about in the first place?
Again, it was one of those sort of situations where after making Ghost, and I thought very kind of innocently, oh, it'd be great to make a house, you know, and it really was, you know, that really was how I sort of thought it, you know, it's gone like that. It wasn't about being incredibly ambitious again, it was just about wanting to take it that next step further. And so we decided upon the house. We knew that everything was going to be demolished around it, and we worked with a structural engineer, figured out that everything would be able to stand up, worked on the inside with a process of spraying concrete, and there was a sort of structure inside it as well, but it was basically a skin of concrete, and then with each floor sort of bolted together. And we worked like that inside it for about 3.5, 4 months, I think. Popped out through the roof, sort of filled up the top in the roof, jumped off a ladder, waited for a bit, peeled the building off, and then we had house. I mean, it makes it sound very simple. It wasn't quite as simple as that, but it was extraordinarily hard work to make it. But it was, but things are that look sort of easy in the end.
The 1993 winner of the Turner Prize is Rachel Whiteread.
How did you come across that house in that street? Was it significant that it was there, or was it an accident that you just happened on it?
I was quite particular about the area that I wanted it to be in.
Why was that?
Just, it was my kind of route to the studio, and it was an area that I knew very well, that was on the verge of gentrification, that was also in the kind of heart of what was very severe poverty, and that, you know, it was a place of change, and I think politically it was an interesting place. When House was first put up, within 3 days of it being put up, or 1 day even, there was a large piece of graffiti put on it called "Homes for All Black and White." Then the next day someone wrote "What for?" and then the next day someone wrote "Why not?" and I just gave up, you know, and then it all sort of hell broke loose.
Do you think part of the reaction was due to bewilderment, and also to do with the feeling that House said something about houses and their life and their place that was a bit worrying?
I think it made people feel very humble and vulnerable and a bit scared. And is that all their lives meant? But I also think that other people found it very empowering. So I think it was just emotionally a very complicated piece of sculpture, and intellectually a complicated piece. And I don't know if I still fully understand what it was. I think it had something to do with the political climate at the time and people just being sick to death of Thatcher.
So it was at this point of change in the East End, and London was beginning to change. Artists were kind of part of that, but also being squeezed out by that change to do with economic development. And many people could relate to those Victorian terrace houses. And she'd suddenly turned it into a ghost version of itself, and this sense that these kind of spaces might not be there anymore. And it was very moving in that sense.
Most of the people around here that I've spoken to, and if you see anybody go on a bus or if you run a bus, they say it's a waste of money, it's just a load of concrete to them.
My personal opinion is that it's a monstrosity, absolutely grotesque, and it might fit well into Welwyn Garden City or somewhere like that, but it doesn't fit well into our environment. She, of course, now is weeping loudly in public and saying that we're forcing her to tear down this seminal work that she's wanted to create all her life.
The sculptor of a house who won this year's Turner Art Prize has watched her work being demolished. It was demolished on the orders of a London council.
But it must be extraordinary to have created a work with that amount of determination and effort, then find it's demolished. I mean, you ever thought of doing it again?
No. No, just I don't think it could be done again. No, and I think that's the power of it, that it was, you know, the thing that happened. It happened for a short period of time. It's in people's memories. It's in sort of folklore, in a way.
It was a magnificent thing, and it roused the most enormous fury. Tower Hamlets Council, they knocked it down. If they'd kept it up, it would be the biggest tourist attraction that Tower Hamlets could possibly have.
In 1993, I lived in Berlin for about 16 months, and during that time, I was very interested in the Holocaust and thought about it a lot, and went to concentration camps and just absorbed what had happened in that city and in other places in Germany. And I think from that experience, I somehow felt equipped as a non-Jew to maybe try and make some work with this subject. And at that time, I was asked to put in a proposal for this. And I didn't really for one moment think that I would actually win the competition.
In 1996, by which time she'd won a Turner Prize, Rachel Whiteread received the commission to create the Judenplatz Memorial in memory of the Austrian victims of the Holocaust.
But it was modeled on the scale of the buildings around us, on the kind of public rooms you would find in some of these buildings. She worked very much to make it, if not site-specific in a sort of traditional modernist way, then site-responsive. But it's the metaphor of it, that this is a room which is closed off, which represents a period of history which one can never fully understand or fully penetrate, is really the way in which the piece operates. I think that the front doors are the most poignant expression of that, because you realize that literally you cannot enter this space, that it has secrets, it has pain, it has things that can't be really touched, but that can be felt.
I was trying to do something within the square that was sensitive to the square, but also quite brutal. And I didn't want it to be something that was easy to look at.
This capacity that her work has to carry stories and to speak about memory, death, you know, longing, all kinds of quite heavy subjects. You can see how she was able to take on a commission like the Holocaust Memorial in Vienna and deal with that without spelling out the history, but very powerfully alluding to it.
The Holocaust Memorial was mired in bureaucratic delays for 6 years. In February 2000, the far-right Freedom Party, known for its anti-Semitism and xenophobia, joined the conservative coalition government of Austria. This inflamed the political debate around the memorial, a government-sponsored project.
When I was making the piece, you know, very unusually for me, I had to make a completed idea in the studio, present an object to a jury. That was what was discussed. Then the argument started. People wanted me to change it, to do all sorts of things, and I absolutely refused to, because I felt that it was a completed object when it was in my studio, and that was how the idea was. And I don't make sculpture by consensus of opinion, so therefore, you know, we got into a few tricky situations.
Es ist aber eine Warnung für künftige Generationen, Der Nationalsozialismus lebt noch. Dieses Mahnmal soll nicht schön sein. Es muss uns und anderen wehtun. Ich danke.
That's a remarkable work. Somehow she managed to put together a monument to that unspeakable event on a site, as it turned out, which they didn't know about at the time, where in the early 15th century a great number of Jewish people had taken their own lives rather than be persecuted. There was, of course, the Jewish community was very sensitive about this, and of course they were. But one way and another, which is credit to all concerned, they got it done, and it is extraordinary. So she has made at least, at the very least, one extraordinary work which will not be pulled down.
What was your reaction when you were asked to make a sculpture to sit on the empty plinth in Trafalgar Square?
My first reaction was, oh, how ridiculous. And kind of half of me wished I'd carried on thinking that, because it was, again, something that ended up being a major headache to do.
When you say it was a nightmare, was that because of the difficulty of making it?
Yes, once again, yes.
Do with a brush.
It was quite a technical feat getting it to work.
And how long did that take you?
About 2.5 years. You know, and you have to pay to do the research and development on projects like this. When we first started working on the plinth, we were having to do all sorts of tests, and we came across an awful lot of problems. There was a lot of leakage initially, and there was cracking, and I think we eventually made about 4 very large test pieces. And even the final test piece, I think, still had a crack in it.
It really is fantastic.
But it's cracked. I've got the added problem of this being in Trafalgar Square, this being my hometown, me being an artist that seems to have a lot of controversy and whatever that follows me around. I really don't want to get into a situation with this piece where, you know, we kind of say it's going to happen, the publicity thing gets rolling, and then it totally kind of screws up again. And then I'm the one that, you know, has to stand there and sort of look stupid.
If you've been wondering what's been kept under wraps in Trafalgar Square over the weekend, and haven't we all, today the secret was revealed. A new piece of public art. It's designed to bring a moment of peace to the bustle of central London. It's also the biggest object ever made from resin.
It weighs 11 tons, and it's a mirror image of the plinth it stands on.
Well, it's another example of boring art. It's the tedium we object to most of all, the pretension and the very dry academic nature of this art, which doesn't really have any blood or guts about it. It's all Emperor's New Clothes stuff, basically.
In something as public like that, in one of London's greatest public squares, in fact, if not the greatest, what does the reaction of the public matter to you?
Yeah, I think it's... what I liked about putting it there, I think, was just that that people could either totally ignore it or just think, you know, if you don't know that there's been this sort of project going on there, then no one would necessarily know what it is. And I just thought it was a bit of a sort of cheeky surprise, really, more than anything.
You've recently been casting spaces in what's going to become your new home and studio, which is a synagogue, which is also in East London.
The building is from the 1950s, and it's a very sort of brutal brick building, which from the outside looks pretty anonymous. Whilst we were making plans about what we would do with the building, I decided that I wanted to cast part of it. And this was really connected with previous pieces that I'd made, like Ghost initially and then House. There are 2 apartments upstairs, and I was wanting to make casts of these rooms that were all interconnecting. But it's technically much more difficult to do this because we're not demolishing the apartment afterwards, so every piece of mouldwork has to be able to come out. So it's actually a very complicated way of working, and you have to have a casting pattern and you have to have a removal pattern. So when I was doing that and I was going up and down the stairs to these apartments, I realised that, and I started thinking about this earlier work that I'd made, and then started thinking about these drawings that I made, which had been of staircases. So I realised here that it was a perfect opportunity to do that. So I'm now casting 3 of the staircases in the building.
Reading about interpretations of your work, they seem to fall into, generally speaking, 2 camps. There's people who speak of you as sort of tough, abstract, minimalist, and the people who read strong emotive associations in your work. Do you have any view on that?
I mean, I think I'm sort of somewhere in the middle, I do like to try and make some very tough pieces, but also some other works, have a certain kind of softness to them. And where that comes from, or, as an artist, you're inventing a language. And, over the years, I've put together my language, and I think by using all the different letters and, verbs and adjectives, I've begun to put things together in a certain way. It's just kind of what I do.